Breaking the Taboo is my new podcast on women's health. And in Series 2, I'll be looking at the issue of birth trauma by speaking to affected mothers, families, healthcare professionals, and campaigners for some practical advice. And like many women, my daughter's birth was not straightforward, and this led me to start campaigning on ending the postcode lottery in maternity care and to chair the UK's birth trauma inquiry in Parliament. So listen into the series and let's break the taboo. And with thanks to our sponsor, the law firm Irwin Mitchell. Well, hello and welcome to today's episode of Breaking the Taboo. And we're now on our second series, and today's episode is looking specifically at the issue of baby loss. And in our last series, we asked listeners what was the topic that they'd most like to listen to if we continued with the podcast. And overwhelmingly, this was the subject that families wrote into me about to say that they wanted to know more about how to cope with losing a baby. So today is a difficult episode to listen to, but I think it's a really important one to have. And I'm really honoured to have two guests in the studio today to talk to you about this, who both have personal lived experience, but have also gone on to become phenomenal campaigners for families who've been affected by baby loss and have made a real difference to their lives through their campaigning with the government. So firstly, I'm delighted to welcome Cherilyn Mackrory, who is a former colleague of mine as the previous Member of Parliament for Truro and Falmouth. And when she was in Parliament, Cherilyn chaired the APPG for baby loss and also for women's health. And she was a huge advocate in the House of Commons for making better and safer maternity services. And her aim has always been to ensure that women were able to make more informed choices and specifically to develop policy to support families after the loss of their baby. Cherilyn also worked with me as the Vice Chair of the UK Parliament's Birth Trauma Inquiry, and I'm sure we'll get on to speak about that later in the show. And she's now Managing Director for Made for Life Organics in Cornwall, helping those to have touch therapy and organic skincare for those particularly living with cancer. So thank you very much, Cherilyn, for joining us and for bravely sharing your story. And later in the episode, we'll also be listening to Theo Clarke, who is a grief specialist, best-selling author, broadcaster and campaigner. And following the devastating loss of 5 babies, she's dedicated her career to transforming support for those experiencing pregnancy and baby loss. She went on to co-found Mariposa International, which is well known for its support division, Saying Goodbye with her husband. And today they're one of the world's leading bereavement support charities, reaching over 50,000 people weekly. And she was later appointed by the UK Secretary of State for Health as the co-chair of the Pregnancy Loss Review, something we'll also talk about in a bit more detail later on the show. So firstly, Cherilyn, if I could welcome you on today to Breaking the Taboo. And I just want to start by saying it's incredibly brave of you to come on today's podcast, particularly given it's such a difficult and a sensitive and very personal subject to talk about baby loss. So I wonder if perhaps you wouldn't mind sharing your story to start the show and talk about the experiences that you faced as a mother.
Well, Theo, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be on your podcast and to be able to help with the work that you're continuing to do outside of Parliament. My story, I suppose, began in the January of 2019, so way before I even knew I was going to become a Member of Parliament. And we had one lovely 4-year-old, and I was happily pregnant with my second baby. And we went for our 20-week scan here in Cornwall, and you lay on the couch, don't you, and they put the cold gel on, and you think everything's going to be okay. We were so confident because I'd had such a easy pregnancy last time and natural birth, and I was fit and healthy and feeling fine. We'd got through all of the NIPT tests and things like that when you're around your 12-week scan, age-related stuff. We were wondering whether things would be all right then, and everything was absolutely fine. We were expecting to go through a natural birth again, and so we weren't expecting to have any problems. But when he looked at the scan on the screen, he straight away said, "I can tell there's something wrong," and your heart just goes into your mouth and you don't know what to do. And I froze, we both froze. And he, because he was a sonographer and not a consultant, wasn't allowed to, or wasn't allowed to, I suppose, diagnose what was going on, but we knew that there was a problem with her brain straight away. He made an appointment for us at the main hospital, and we went straight to Truro. And the lovely, lovely consultant there did diagnose a very severe case of spina bifida in our baby. And your mind is racing. And at this point, I want to say how brilliant the Royal Cornwall Hospital team were at Treliske here in Cornwall, because the amount of care that we got, and I'll come to why that was already in place a bit later on, was absolutely fantastic. And we had quite a few hours with a bereavement midwife when we were sort of first in shock, explaining all of our options and what we had to do. But in short, the consultant sort of straight away said that there was going to be nothing we could do for this baby. Any of the sort of intravenous remedies that they were thinking of at the time weren't going to be appropriate here. And what they can't do is tell you to terminate your baby. It has to be your decision. But let me tell you, Theo, when you're in the room and they're shaking their head at you, you don't really have a choice. And then we had to come in the next day for the termination, which was, just one of the hardest things I've ever done, because it took about 15 minutes and you can see it all happening. And I was incredibly frightened, and, my husband was incredibly frightened. We didn't really know what was happening, even though they looked after us. It's just such a horrible thing to happen. Um, and then, and this is another thing that I don't tell you, you have to wait a couple of days so you can still feel your baby inside. And then we were brought in again to deliver. And the Treliske Hospital has got this wonderful suite called the Daisy Suite, which is purpose made for people who are losing their babies, so that you can't, you don't have to traipse around the maternity ward, and everything is self-enclosed. But when we got there, even though we thought we were going there, there was already a lovely poor girl in there who was losing her baby at 38 weeks, and she needed it more than we did. So we went into one of the normal rooms, and I laboured for 8 or 9 hours, and then our baby was born, and it was a little girl and we called her Lily. We didn't know we were going to call her Lily. She probably wouldn't have been Lily had she survived, but we thought it was a very peaceful name, so we called her Lily Wren. And my husband was he couldn't see her. It was too traumatic for him. So even though he'd stayed with me, he went out to sort of tell relatives what had happened, and then I was able to see her and cuddle her, and give her a kiss and just tell her how much she's loved. And then I had to let her go. Oh gosh, we're 6 years on and it still hurts. But what I want to say is that the midwives who helped me that day are unbelievably special. And when we come on to why you and I are fighting for this, we come at it from very different experiences, because my experiences of the midwives at Cornwall were they were, I would describe her as an angel, the one that took her away, because she wanted to look after my baby. She wanted to show her the stars. She just wanted to treat her like a normal baby. And I will never forget the kindness that she showed that day. Um, so we were left babyless, and we came home. And it's a very unnatural thing to do, to leave your baby in a hospital knowing that she will never come home. And then the grief takes over, but it's more than that. It's like a biological urge to have a child. And I suddenly sort of understood why some animals and even some people will take babies, because this biological urge to have this, to mother something, was something I'd never felt before. It was a very, very raw grief. And so it, as grief does, it wore on, and eventually you sort of, come back out into the world and face it again. And I was lucky in a way that I was also a Cornwall councillor at the time, and the Democratic Services people there said, "You do know you can go for some counselling." So I did, and 6 weeks of counselling really did help me to process what had happened, the guilt that I was feeling that I couldn't help this baby, the how was I going to be a good mother? How do I convey this to our little girl that we already had? How can I, focus on her again? So there was an awful lot of processing that had to happen, and it really, really did help. But where I think that the NHS was not able to help us where I wanted them to was, A, they they were going to give us both counselling, but they didn't. The resources weren't there. And very soon after we'd been discharged, we were sort of, not, I guess, forgotten about, but only because the resources weren't there to do the next part of the care. So my husband was never ever offered any counselling at all. And, I think men and women probably process these things very differently, or just people process things in different ways. And, he was never able to uh, be given the same resource to understand why and process the guilt in the same way that I had done. So it never gets any easier to tell the story, Theo, but I have to keep telling it because it's important that when people are listening to stories like this, what I found was more people have been through this than you realise until you start telling the story. And when I spoke about it in Parliament, the amount of letters and emails I received from families who've been through the same thing, thanking you for speaking up, thanking me for speaking up. You'll know from your experience, this is way more common than people realise, and people are still suffering in silence, thinking it doesn't matter. But I want to tell them it does matter, and they do matter.
Well, firstly, Sharon, can I just say you've been incredibly brave to talk so personally about your experience. And I know that listeners to the show have said that they found it very powerful to hear families who've experienced similar trauma to themselves because it helps them to not feel alone. So thank you for starting with that. And to be honest, I was really shocked to hear that you weren't able to use the bereavement suites because they didn't have enough space. And that must have been incredibly difficult to be alongside other mothers in labour that you knew were going to have healthy babies and you knew that you were going to go home without your daughter. Can I just ask then, in terms of what resources you were offered after birth? You talked about counselling, but could you just explain a bit about the process and what you were offered in terms of services? Because I'd like to help other mothers to understand kind of what help is out there so that they can get access to the resources that they need.
Absolutely. We obviously you don't know until you're in the boat what you're going to be offered, and I think there is still a bit of a postcode lottery as some areas of the country having all of this in place and others weren't. I think we were lucky in Cornwall in that Cornwall had done a really good job at trying to get most or if not all of it in place. So as I say, when we went in, we had an awful lot of time with a bereavement midwife. Well, not all trusts have that resource, and so we were lucky that we did. And what the bereavement midwife did was, apart from explaining all of the options with us and going through all of the paperwork that we had to have with us, they give you lots and lots of options as to what you want to happen with your baby. Do you want to see your baby? Do you want your baby to come home for its funeral? Do you want your baby to be remembered in the Garden of Remembrance? Do you want photographs of your baby? Do you want mementos of your baby? Do you want to leave anything with your baby? And it's a lot to take in. You don't really take it in on the first day, but as the days progress, you do. And we did leave one of Chloe's baby toys. Chloe's my eldest girl. We left one of her baby toys with our baby, and I have a memento where they give half to the baby and I keep half. And I did ask them to take some photographs, but it was a good couple of months before I dared to actually ask for those to come home. And I keep all of those things now in a little box in my room, and on her anniversary or just when I'm wanting to think about her, I can go to that box and look at them and remember that she existed, because often if you don't have those things, it just feels like it was a memory or a bad dream. But to remind myself that she was a real person and she did exist is actually a real comfort for me. And as I say, I keep saying everybody processes these things differently, and some people wouldn't feel like that. But I met another mum, another school mum, had a daughter the same age as mine, and she'd been through a similar thing in a different country, and she had been put under exactly the same week's pregnancy, exactly the same condition, and she'd been put under a general anaesthetic. The baby had been born by cesarean section, and she had never met her baby, and it had just gone. And she couldn't believe the amount of care that we were getting, and it took her a lot longer to process what had happened. So we were able to compare those stories, and I think. And when I became a member of Parliament, and we started with the all-party group, the work that had already been done on the National Bereavement Care Pathway had led to a lot of this care, and it is about care. And it is about treating that baby as a real person. It's about understanding that families will all process things differently, and giving families privacy and time to spend time with their babies before they have to be separated. And I haven't got anything to compare it to with my personal experience, but I am forever grateful that that was in place, so that I have those mementos now, and I can remember her in my own way.
Well, I think you made a really important point there, Cherilyn, as well about your older daughter and your husband. And I just wanted to talk about the kind of wider impact on the family. And as you said, it's a very difficult subject to talk about. And, anniversaries, birthdays are such a painful reminder. And I think a lot of friends or people in the workplace really don't know what to say in that scenario. So firstly, could I just ask on a really practical level, like, what did you do in that scenario? So did you tell your work colleagues? Did you tell immediate family and friends? And do you have any advice for parents who have got other siblings, particularly when they're young children, of what you do in that scenario?
Again, all families are different, and all relationships are different. So a stat that I learned at the time was that 50% of relationships break down after you lose a child, after you lose a baby. And we were determined for that not to be the case, but it is really, really difficult. And the difficulty is that the one person you want to rely on, that you would normally rely on if a parent or a sibling had passed away, is your husband, but he is as hurt as you are. And I think the dads, I'll say dads, but it is birth partners, they get forgotten sometimes, and they are as hurt, and also they're supposed to be the ones that are fixing you. The outside world sees them as your protector, and therefore they often don't get the space to grieve. And I would challenge that. I think it's important that dads do get the chance to talk to other people who've been through the same situation. And we noticed when we talked to our friends and family that those people who had children already absolutely got it, and we were lucky that we had some good friends to talk to us on all sides, and actually people who hadn't had kids didn't seem to quite get it in the same way, and I don't know if that's a thing, but that was our experience. The advice I would give is absolutely rely on your good friends and family. We're lucky we've got really close family, so my mum and dad and my sisters were brilliant. Rely on whoever you can outside of your relationship, because you will get through this at different rates and very differently. And if you try to rely on each other too much, you will bust apart, I think. So yeah, absolutely rely on as many friends and families as you can, and just when you need to escape the house, do just go. And as far as our other daughter went, the counsellor's advice was to be absolutely open and honest with them, to tell them everything, and to not hide anything. And for some reason we didn't actually follow that advice. She was 4 years old, and I didn't want this sister that wasn't to be a spectre of her childhood. So still don't know, because she's only 10, still don't know whether we've done it the right way or not. But what we agreed was we sort of told her what had happened at the time. She thought a baby was coming home and a baby wasn't, and actually the way that we put it to her was, sometimes you plant some flowers and you feed them the same way, but some of them grow and some of them don't. And she sort of understood that analogy. And then she never really asked any questions. And it's only recently she sort of asked a couple of questions, and we don't lie about it. We say, yes, we nearly had a baby sister, but we didn't. And as she grows older, those things will become probably deeper conversations. But what I don't want to do is frighten her, because she one day will be pregnant, and I want that to be a wonderful experience for her as well. And even though we didn't go on to have any more children, which actually most people who lose a baby do, that was because we were just too scared, and I don't want to project that onto her, and I want her to be excited about becoming a mum when it's time for her.
Oh, that's such an important point. And I was really struck by what you were saying about your husband earlier, that firstly, he obviously wasn't part of any care pathway, because technically he was not the person giving birth, but obviously was very traumatised too. And interestingly, in series 1, where we were looking at birth trauma, we actually had an episode on dads, and we had 2 fathers come on, one of whom had experienced, multiple baby loss examples. And it was really shocking to hear how they developed PTSD and gone on to have all these other symptoms when something had gone wrong. And I think we've got to do more to provide support for the whole wider family, as well as the mum in this case. Can I just ask, in terms of going back to work, Cherilyn, it's something the government's been campaigning on with different backbench MPs for the last few years, is about obviously bereavement and miscarriage leave. Did you go back to work straight away? Did you take several weeks off And what are the kind of changes that have just come in Parliament to hopefully improve the situation for families going through such a traumatic time in their lives?
Well, I was lucky. I worked for an understanding employer, so and they were as upset for us as most people would be. So I was lucky enough to be able to take 6 weeks off. I had to keep going back to the doctors for my sick notes, fit notes, whatever we call them, and sh and actually that was quite a trying thing, when you don't really want to go anywhere. The fact that you have to keep going back to the doctors every 2 weeks for your sick note to make sure that I mean, they would sign it straight away, of course they would, but it was that action of having to go. Having said that, and I probably would have, given the opportunity, I probably would have stayed off a lot longer because I was in a deep grieving process. However, I was encouraged by friends and family to go back to work after 6 weeks, and I'm really glad I did, because I think you're in danger of falling into a more permanent depression if you don't start to re-engage. It's easy for me to say that now. I'm 6 years down the line, but in hindsight, I'm pleased that people did encourage me to go. And I don't think my employer would have given me much longer off than that. I'm pleased that miscarriage is being recognised as something that people do need time off for. I was never a massive advocate for legislating for this because, again, everybody is different and every employer is different. And one would hope, if you have an open relationship, and honest relationship with your employers, that actually this sort of thing would happen anyway. I get that not all employers are understanding, so perhaps we did need to do something just to push it up the agenda and make sure it was being recognised properly. So I think it's a good thing that this has happened. It just means that women and families are able to have a legitimate conversation with potentially with an HR department in a huge company, rather than I was very lucky. I was working for a small business at the time, so I was able to have those conversations. So I do think it's important that these things have been recognised, and in hindsight, even though I wasn't pushing for the legislation there, I think it's a good thing that it's happened.
And I have to say thank you to Cherilyn, because I was in Parliament when you were the chair of the all-party parliamentary group on baby loss, and you did so much campaigning to improve the standards in hospitals on safety and working with maternity units. And obviously you came and joined the committee with myself and Rosie Duffield and other cross-party politicians on the birth trauma inquiry. But the thing I wanted to let listeners know is that Cherilyn gave an incredibly powerful speech, standing up in Parliament and talking about her personal experience, which you've just heard. And I just want to make the point that it's really important to share these stories and not to feel like you're alone and that you can't talk about it. And actually, I think we've both had a similar experience, Cherilyn, where we both have shared our birth trauma stories very publicly. And I think we've both been very overwhelmed by the huge number of people who've written to us to say that they've had the same and that they didn't feel they could share their story. But by us talking about it very publicly, they didn't feel alone. So I think that's a really important point to say. And could I just talk a bit about some of the new things that have come in the last few years in Parliament, very much a result of both you, Cherilyn, and Zoe, who's our later guest today, campaigning on this issue. And that's specifically the pregnancy loss certificates. So for listeners who don't know about those, they're a new thing that have just been brought in by the government. What are they, and how would they go about getting one?
Well, first of all, Theo, I wanted to. First of all, thank you for your kind words about the speeches that were made in Parliament. And it was an honour to sit next to you actually when you did yours, and the round of applause you received is a first in Parliament that I've ever seen. I think it was phenomenal. So you did an amazing job there. And you'll know that when we do these debates, it actually shows Parliament at its best. We all become human again, and this ridiculous party politics goes out the window, and actually everybody can understand that we're all human and we all have our stories. And I do think it's important that Parliament keeps doing this. And if I have any influence in making that happen, I would do that again. When you get upset, somebody from across the aisle will intervene just to give you a couple of minutes to compose yourself, and everybody understands the human side of politics and remembers that MPs have families who love them as well, which is important. And thank you for inviting me to join you and Rosie on the birth trauma inquiry. I really enjoyed being part of such an important inquiry. There was a huge overlap actually with the work that we were doing on the all-party group for baby loss, with what you were doing there, the inequalities that we're still finding in certain trusts and with certain and demographics of the country. So there's a huge amount to do there, and I'm hoping I can still be part of that conversation at some point. Um, the pregnancy loss certificate was an amazing piece of legislation that came in shortly before the general election, if I remember. I think it was last spring it came in, and it just means that you can now apply for a certificate for a baby who was lost before the 24 weeks cut off, because at 24 weeks, a loss becomes a stillbirth. Prior to that, it is technically known as a late miscarriage or a miscarriage. And all sorts of different things kick in at the 24-week period at the moment. The maternity leave you can still take, and your baby will get a birth and death certificate. But prior to 24 weeks, there was nothing. And when we lost Lily, we lost her in the January, and in the October, there was a baby loss Awareness Week service in Truro, and we went, and there was a book of remembrance, and I went to her date, and there was her name, and it was a real wow. She existed. Her name, somebody else has written her name somewhere, therefore she existed. And I think this is an amazing new tool that families can have to apply for a certificate. You need both parents on there, and you can keep that with your box of mementos, and you can look at it, and in years to come it can be part of your family records that your baby existed. They were a real person, and they weren't just a miscarriage. And it's hugely important. It brings a massive amount of comfort to families up and down the country, and I just think it's yet another step along the pathway of recognising that this is not just women's problems. This is not just something that went wrong and we don't talk about and it all gets hushed away. These are our babies. These are our children. These are our grandchildren. This is we're changing as a society when we start to recognise this, and it can only be a good thing.
And I think it's important for listeners to know that you can register it for multiple babies as well. So I know Zoe, who's coming on the show later, has actually suffered from 5 baby loss times, and I think it's important that each of those individuals is recognised, and you can absolutely do it for every single one of them. So Cherilyn, a question I always like to ask every guest on the show is some really practical advice for listeners. So if there was one thing as a resource that you could point affected families to who've also suffered from baby loss, what would you like to share with them?
Well, as a practical resource, I would encourage anybody to contact the charity SANS. They have a multitude of resources for families and for employers and employees and anybody who is around or is the person who has lost a baby. If you're lucky enough to live in an area where they do peer-to-peer support, that is where mums and dads can go to speak to people who have been through the same trauma. It just helps you realise that there are an awful lot of people in this. It's a club that nobody really wants to join. They often say that for things like this, but there are a lot of like-minded people on there. But if I can just sneak in a second one, it would be what I said earlier. Just rely on anybody and everybody you can outside of your relationship, and protect those people you love the most, because they want to protect you too.
That's really helpful. And I'll make sure in the show notes we have links to some of the charities mentioned on today's episodes. And SANS is a brilliant organisation. And if I could ask for a sort of second follow-up to that, obviously living with the loss of your baby is incredibly difficult. And some families will be thinking about, having another go at trying to have another baby, which I think comes with a lot of fear as well, because you think, well, something went wrong last time. Do I think I can try again? So is there anything you like to say to kind of reassure families in that scenario?
In my situation, I was told this was a one-off, this wouldn't happen again, it wasn't age-related, it was just one of those things. And I was able to get some closure on that. And I think if you can find out as much about what happened, then that is fantastic. Midwives are there to help you. They are phenomenal people, and they want to help you go through another successful pregnancy to make sure that you get your baby. You will feel fear, and I just think keep talking to people around you, keep talking to the healthcare professionals who are there to help you. The vast majority of times your next pregnancy will be okay. It doesn't happen with everybody, but the vast majority of times your next pregnancy will be okay. Take all the tests that they offer you, and just take every day as it comes. I think we live in a society now where we take for granted that healthcare will fix all of our problems, but actually childbirth and pregnancy is still one of those things where, we just have to rely on the experts and take every day as it comes. But when it goes right, it's the most phenomenal experience.
Absolutely. And I was at the Mum and Baby Awards earlier this year in Westminster, And I met some really incredible families and NHS professionals who'd obviously made such a difference to the lives of these affected mums and were really caring and compassionate and totally understood what a very difficult situation they're in. So I'd just like to say a thank you to all the kind of unsung heroes out there in the NHS and our health service who are doing such important work. And finally, my last question for you, Cherilyn, is a slightly more political one, which is that, if you could imagine that the Prime Minister or the Health Secretary was listening to Breaking the Taboo, and you wanted him to improve maternity care and the instances that we've been describing today, what would you like him to do?
Well, there are two things I think, and they do relate to each other. So the first one would be to increase the number of midwives that we've got. And one way that they're trying to do that we started actually, Theo, was degree apprenticeships for midwives. And I would love to see them grow that programme so people can learn on the job and earn money as they go and become midwives that way. And the second, which is related, would be continuity of carer, because if you can see the same midwife or the same small group of midwives, they get to know you. It helps outcomes like you wouldn't believe. They can spot things like lifestyle issues that might be putting your pregnancy at risk, but certainly things like domestic violence and particularly what we've been talking about. If you've had a particularly hard or traumatic birth previously, or you've lost a baby previously, you don't then have to keep repeating it to somebody new, because that person will know your story and they will be treating you with the care that you need and you deserve.
Well, those are really practical recommendations, and I totally agree with you about not having to share your story multiple times and having, the same person that you can speak to who kind of understands your situation and can be much more empathetic in that case. Well, Cherilyn, can I say thank you so much for coming on the show today? I know it was really emotional for you to talk about what happened to your daughter, but I think it's so powerful for us to hear and to listen to these stories. And I hope for anyone listening to the show today to know you're not alone, and also there is help out there. And I think Cherilyn's given you some personal examples from her own experience, but also directed you to some really useful practical resources and charities out there to help you. So on the website, there'll be a lot of links to useful links. We'll also have a link to the pregnancy loss certificates, so you know how to get those. And Cherilyn, thank you so much. Please keep up the campaign. I think it's so important that politicians hear this and know that these mums are not going away. We want to see action, and we know there's so much more we can do, and steps in the right direction are being taken on things like the new certificates. But of course, there's always so much more we could do. But thank you for coming on the show, and it's really been a privilege and an honour to hear your story. So thank you.
Thanks, Theo.
Well, I'm delighted for the second half of today's special episode on baby loss to have as my guest Zoe Clarke-Coates, who has really been a amazing campaigner on baby loss. So Zoe, thank you so much for joining us. We've just had a really interesting discussion with my former colleague, Cherilyn Mackrory, who was an MP, and talked very movingly about her experience of baby loss in Parliament. And I wondered, Zoe, if perhaps we could start with your personal story too. And there's a lot of overlap on your political campaigning, particularly on baby loss certificates, which we can get onto a bit later in the show. So firstly, welcome to Breaking the Taboo. And I really do appreciate you sharing your story, because I know it's incredibly difficult to talk about this subject, but I think so important for families to hear. So if you wouldn't mind sharing what happened to you, perhaps we could start there.
Yeah, so professionally, I was already a grief specialist. I was already a counsellor who had worked extensively in the field of loss and grief and trauma, especially. And so I felt like I understood the whole process. I was trained in it. My mum's also a therapist, so I'd got a real extensive background, family experience of working in this space too. And then we decided to try for children. And I think really naively, even though we knew about loss, we knew about baby loss, we really just didn't think it would happen to us. And I guess that's what everybody will say when they're sharing their story, that you know the stats, you're fully aware, but you just think it won't happen to you. You hear the stats of 1 in 4, but you feel like you're going to be one of the 3 in 4 who brings home a baby. But sadly, we tried for a baby and lost our first baby. And that's when we heard all the cliches for the first time, that this happens to loads of people, and you just focus on your next pregnancy and etc. And we tried to move forward really positively, and then we got pregnant again, and this pregnancy just felt really different. And we'd been going for scans, we'd been watching our daughter grow, and on one afternoon, I think it was, I started to bleed. I was quickly given a private scan, and that private scan showed she was absolutely fine. We could see her moving and waving, and everything was okay. But 24 hours later, things seemed to change again, and the bleeding increased, and I just had this horrible sense that she'd passed away. And that's when we went to our local NHS hospital, and we received really poor care. And we were met with just little compassion. We were asked why we were so upset. Was it because she was an IVF baby and we'd paid for her? Which instantly made us feel like our permission to be upset was removed, and that we were somehow overreacting by being upset. And we were told a scan couldn't be done, that I'd had a scan 24 hours before, that all was fine, so why would anything have changed? And we were told to just go home, and the earliest they could put me in for another scan would be a week's time, but to presume everything was fine still. I'm the least patient person and just couldn't wait. And so we started to leave messages on Clinic's answer machines. It was a weekend. And on the Monday morning, a clinic phoned us and said, if you come to us immediately, we can fit you in now for a scan. And we did, hoping for the best, but being also terrified. And it was during that scan that we were told that she had passed away. They couldn't see a reason. They could just see the fact that her heart was no longer beating, but she was still fully there. And so we were sent away, asked to make decisions, and I ended up actually delivering her a week to the day, and it felt like our world had completely shattered. That first loss had totally devastated us, but this just felt really different. We had really been in a place of hope and thinking everything was fine, and the scans were all fine. And it was through that we saw that there wasn't really support out there. Actually, our doctor told us not to go looking for support, that it actually may do more damage than good, which really shocked me as a professional in the field. But I was also understanding of that, because I know what a difference good support makes. And if you get bad support or care, how that can actually be so detrimental to you. So we didn't go looking for support. We just got the support that we needed from one another and from my mum, who's a therapist, like I mentioned. And not long after, we decided to try again, and we tragically then lost our third baby. And I think it was at that point that we started to really lose hope that we might ever get to bring a baby home. And it felt like we weren't just grieving these precious babies, we were also grieving the fact that we may never get to raise a child, and had to really look into the dark valley of loss of what will our life actually be like if we don't get our heart's desire and don't get to raise a child. During that time, I'd actually made a decision that I don't think we should try again. I thought that it was too much risk, and our hearts were just so shattered and so broken. But then I discovered I was pregnant, and it was such a blessing, because it felt like the decision had been taken out of our hands, because the decision to try again was the hardest. And actually, here I was, found out I was pregnant. Our doctor, who was also a friend, Chris, was amazing and was just so caring and so reassuring that there was nothing that we could do to change the outcome. So we just had to take it day by day, which was torturous. But that's the first baby we got to bring home from the hospital. So that's our Esme. And we thought we would stop at having just her and not continue on having more. But within months of her being here, the conversation was open again. Would we have another child, and should we? And we felt like our dealings with loss were behind us. As soon as you get to bring home a baby from the hospital, you just think whatever's wrong is somehow now miraculously fixed. And it was when, I don't know how old she was, just over 1 maybe, we started to really start considering trying again. And eventually we did try again. And everything was going amazing with the pregnancy. We were going and watching our little boy Samuel growing on the scans. Everything was great. And then on one horrible afternoon, we were at the clinic with our daughter who was with us. And Chris, the doctor's face just fell. And he said, I don't even know how to tell you, but his heart stopped beating. And I asked to leave the room, and I remember going into the restroom and just screaming and falling down the wall and going, no, not again. I cannot possibly encounter this again. We decided to go the surgical route that time because of having Esme and not wanting it to be drawn out for a long period of time. And so I went in for surgery and delivered him in surgery. And yeah, it felt really different that time. The loss was just as weighty, just as significant, but we weren't grieving the fact that we might never get to raise a child because we'd got Esme, but we were grieving also for her sibling. And what if we can't ever give her a sibling to play with? And she just loved the children so much, which is what had made us start discussing having a child again. Anyway, and so the thought of not being able to give her that was literally heartbreaking. We decided to try again, and we had told the whole family we were expecting again on Christmas Eve at a Christmas Eve party. And 10 minutes later, I started to bleed, and it was confirmed by the doctor that I'd gone through loss again. And so we spent that whole Christmas grieving, mourning, trying to make Christmas as magical as possible for our daughter, while also knowing here we are again going through loss. But in the January, I started to get sicker and sicker. And eventually we went to see a consultant and found out that the doctors had been wrong and I hadn't gone through loss. And I was in fact still expecting, and they'd misdiagnosed a miscarriage. And it was later then confirmed that I was expecting twins. So I went from grieving to being, I can't believe it, we're actually growing 2 babies. So we're going to have 3 children with us here, which felt so miraculous after we'd spent that whole Christmas grieving. Sadly, I then got iller and iller during that pregnancy, ended up needing to have multiple surgeries to save my life and to then save the babies' lives. Tragically, we lost one of the twins during the pregnancy, but we got to bring home our other daughter, who we are blessed to get to raise, Bronte. So that was our story of losing 5 precious children, one being our daughter's twin, Isabella, and getting us to the place we are today.
Wow. Well, so firstly, thank you so much for sharing your story, and it's incredibly difficult to hear such a story of heartbreak, but I think so many of the families listening to the show says it helps them to not feel alone, to know
absolutely.
that other people have been through similar experiences. I was very struck by what you just said about having had baby loss and then trying again, how incredibly traumatic that is to try and get pregnant again. And just reading through kind of listener feedback and reading through our social media posts, a lot of people have messaged me to say, I'd like to have another baby, but I don't know if I'm strong enough to try again, having had a miscarriage or baby loss. So is there some kind of advice or reassurance that you'd like to give mothers out there listening to say that you did try again and it was difficult and it was hard, but that they really should try if they want to have a bigger family?
Yeah, I think it's a really hard decision, and I don't think anybody will ever feel ready. And for a while, that's what I was waiting for, to feel ready. But that's like saying you're ready to go and stand in the middle of the road and wait to see if you're going to be hit by a car. You know, are you ever going to be at that place? No one can ever guarantee you the outcome that you want. And so because of that, it's always going to be this huge gamble, this huge risk of weighing up the utter heartache that you might experience again, but also the flip side that you might get everything you ever wanted, which is a baby in your arms. And I quickly learned that I wouldn't ever feel ready. And I had to make a decision based on how I wanted my life to look. And if I wanted to raise more babies, then I had to make the decision that the pain of living without those children was greater than the pain of grieving more losses and more babies. And for me, that made it quite an easy decision, actually. It felt like I can't imagine grieving. I can't imagine the what ifs. But I also, the thought of living with the agony of not being in a place where I could risk that pain, that for me felt worse, that I was going to have to live with all that what if and live with what would it have been different. And I decided that I would rather go with the risk of more heartache. But I think it's such a personal decision. And as a charity, we support over 50,000 people a week globally. And so I speak to literally thousands of families a week who are making these decisions. And people will always ask me, how do I know? How do I know if it's time? How do I know if it's right? And that's all I reassure people, that you're not going to feel ready. If you're waiting for that, then I can tell you right now that that's not going to happen, because no one's in a position where they're going to be ready for more heartache and pain. And it's a pain like no other. So of course it's natural to fear it. But if you can look at your life and think, what are you going to regret more? Not trying or trying? Then I think that makes the decision a lot easier, and it becomes a lot more factual rather than looking at the emotion part of it. But it's also, there's so many other things to weigh into that decision. The strength of your relationship, the strength of your home life and situation, and the support you've got around you. If you do encounter the worst again, what's that going to look like for you in the aftermath? And what's your work life going to be like? There's so many factors that no one can make that decision for you. And the thing that I really dislike in this space is people saying, oh, you were so brave to try again, which insinuates those that choose not to try again are less brave. And I don't think that is true at all. I think at times it takes more bravery to say enough. I can't do it again, and I shouldn't do it again. And I shouldn't do it again, maybe for my family life or for whatever other reason. So I don't think this is a matter of bravery. I think it's a matter of decisions and choices, and only you can possibly know what's right and wrong. And what really helped me in our decision-making process as well is the fact that I'm married to my soulmate, my best friend, and I always knew that we were enough, that we'd got that relationship that would mean we would always be okay in that. And that took so much pressure off, because I think where people, one part of a partnership is really pushing for something and the other is reluctant, I think that is really, really hard if you're not on the same page. Where for us, we were like, we are enough for one another. And then we'd already got Esme as well, and she was enough for us. We didn't want her to ever think she wasn't enough. And so, again, that helped in the decision-making process. I think if there'd been a pressure from any angle, that would have made it even harder, and I'd have probably froze in the decision-making process. But having that amount of love and support around us both, it made it easier.
That's really helpful advice. And just listening to you, Zoe, I mean, it's incredibly difficult to live with the grief of multiple losses. Could we just talk a bit about your personal experience? Like, did you undertake counselling? Did you see a bereavement specialist? Is there anything that you did that was helpful and that you'd like to sort of signpost other mothers to find similar services?
Yeah, no, we didn't. So we didn't go looking for support, as I said, because the doctor had advised us not to. We obviously had a brief look, and And for us, the support that was available was not appealing in any way. And the reason for that being is that the support organisations that were out there were very segregated in the support that they offered. So one organisation would support this type of loss, and another organisation would support losses after that gestation, and another up to that gestation. And all of our losses were very different. They were at different gestations, different points, but all of them were just as significant. And so for us to segregate those losses, that, well, we can go to this organisation to talk about this loss, for us said that our other babies were less significant because they didn't fit into that category. And so that was one of the reasons that we really did heed the doctor's advice and didn't go looking, because we knew we would end up speaking to multiple different organisations about different babies. And for us, every one of our babies mattered, and every one of our babies were just as significant. The gestation that they passed on was totally irrelevant, which is why I never talk about the gestation, because it's not relevant at all. They were all our children, and from the moment we knew we were expecting them, we loved them. And that was really, really important to us, that anyone we spoke to address that with us, and we needed to know they could see that, they recognised that, and to them they were just as important as one another at whatever age they passed at. I'd also then got my mum, who had been a therapist for a very long time with extensive experience in all of these areas. And so we really did have those internal resources and support available to us. So we were able to just pick up the phone, and I'd have my mum there, and they actually came and stayed with us for days after the losses. And so I literally had a therapist in the house. But I also had all of that training and background information to know how to process grief really healthily, and what the mechanisms were. And a lot of the support that we offer to people is so often reassuring people that what they're experiencing is normal and they're not going crazy, that this is a normal part of the grieving process. And obviously I didn't have any of those fears and questions because I had got the training in it. So I knew everything I was feeling was totally normal. I also didn't fear the process. And I think when a lot of people are going through loss, so much of the aftermath of losing their baby or anybody else they may love is so much fear of what's tomorrow going to look like, and is this okay? Am I grieving in a normal, healthily way, or do I need professional help at any point? Where I didn't have any of that because I knew everything that I was feeling was normal. I knew the desperation was normal. I knew that even wanting to not be here anymore was normal, that I'd go to sleep every night hoping and praying I wouldn't wake up in the morning. And I wasn't suicidal. I would have never ended my own life, but I just prayed that my life would naturally come to an end every night and I wouldn't wake up, because the pain of living was so agonizing. And I knew that was normal. I knew that's a normal part of the grieving process, where you want to be with the ones that have passed away. And I knew that was nothing to fear. I knew that it was temporary. I knew that that would pass, and that eventually I would come out of that valley and I would be able to feel hope again. I'd be able to feel joy again. And so my grieving process was very different to a lot of people, and I'll be forever thankful about that.
Yeah. Well, obviously, Zoe, you had a very unusual background for a mum who went on to suffer baby loss. But for a lot of the families listening to the show, they won't know any of those things or how to cope and deal with grief. So perhaps that's a good moment to bring in the work of your fantastic charity. And if anyone who's come across Saying Goodbye, which was set up by Zoe, and she's written a brilliant book as well about her personal experience and some other guides to sort of dealing with baby loss. So Zoe, do you want to say a bit about the charity and what you do? And what I'd specifically like to hear is kind of how can we help other families who are suffering from this and don't have your background and are not sure how to deal with the grief? What advice do you have for them?
Yeah, so we set up the charity when our second daughter was 6 months old, and we were so acutely aware that our journey had then concluded. We'd got our daughters in our arms, and we'd been in a really privileged and blessed position with having the support available. And it was in the aftermath I started to really question, so what are other families doing? What are other individuals doing? I was lying on the bathroom floor, begging for the pain to end, but I knew that it would because of our training. What about those who don't have that? How do they navigate this unbelievable trauma and then re-find the path that they need to walk on, whether that be trying for more children or whether that be grieving for the children they've lost, knowing that that may be the end of their journey to grow their family or have a family at all. And so I went to my husband. We owned an international events and PR company. Our clients were people like Coca-Cola, Bupa, big companies around the world. And I said to my husband, I'd really love to do something in this space. How about we set up a not-for-profit division of our company, holding events, holding remembrance events at cathedrals around the country, so people who haven't had the chance to gather together to mourn, to grieve, and to acknowledge a life that's been lost. And he was instantly on board and said, absolutely, what a great way of helping other families. It just literally exploded overnight. I think within the first 6 months, our website was having over 650,000 hits a month. And we realised what we had launched was something that people needed, not just in the UK, but also around the world. So we quickly discovered that we would need to separate it out from the company. And so we applied for charitable status and separated it out as an organisation where the company just supported then the charity rather than it just being a division within the company. And that's when it became Mariposa, and now known as Mariposa International. That's the global organisation name. And our primary support division is Saying Goodbye. So most people call us the Saying Goodbye organisation because that's the primary support. And it just grew and grew and grew till today. We now support over 50,000 people each week. We operate in every country around the world. We are, I believe, the only UK baby loss charity serving families globally. And we are the chairs of the Global Baby Loss Alliance, bringing together NGOs and organisations to change clinical and compassionate care around the world.
So I think that's a really good time for us to turn to your incredible work as a campaigner. And we heard earlier in the episode from Cherilyn, who is an MP, obviously has been campaigning alongside you on the baby loss certificates. But if we could just go back a few years a bit earlier. So you've been campaigning on this for a long time outside of Parliament yourself. And I know the Health Secretary asked you to co-chair the government's pregnancy loss review. So could you just tell us a bit about that and what the recommendations were that you discovered? And how did you become a campaigner, having been an affected mum who, unlike Cherilyn, was not a member of Parliament and was not in the political world?
Yeah, so it was because of all the frustrations we were hearing and the poor care we'd received that we knew we needed to do something about it. So we started campaigning on various topics for better care. I'm really blessed to be a grief specialist in the space that's called upon for most celebrities who go through loss, royals who go through loss, and especially in the media and press. So I get so many opportunities to talk about these subjects that are really important. And I'm regularly asked, is there anything you're working on that you'd like to come on this show to talk about, etc. And it was on one of those occasions I was on BBC Breakfast, and they said, what do you want to talk about? And I said, well, what we'd really like to bring in is a baby loss certificate, because so many of the families we're supporting are saying that the lack of recognition that their baby even existed is just so hard, and they just don't know how they'll ever be able to move on from that. And where this has become even more of a noticeable issue is that babies are surviving at a younger gestation. And so we were hearing again and again from families who had lost twins, where one of their twins lived beyond 24 weeks. And so got a stillbirth certificate or a birth and death certificate. But the other sibling who passed away in utero didn't get any recognition, to the point that even on the certificates, it's not even logged that they were a multiple. It's just that they were a single child. And these families were saying to us again and again, this is unjust. My babies are going to be buried in the same grave, but yet one gets formally recognised and the other never even existed. And then obviously the tens of thousands of families who aren't in that situation, but just feel that to just walk away with possibly a scan picture is not enough, that they wanted something more. They wanted something that could be included in their family records, something that they could say to future possible siblings, this was your sibling's certificate and this was the point they died, and then they'd got nothing like that. So I was on BBC Breakfast talking about that. And up until that point, no one was supporting us in our campaign to do it. We were literally a lone voice. There was no other charities that were willing to stand with us or work with us on it. And so we really felt like we were screaming from the hilltop saying, this is needed. Please, someone join with us. And it was after being on BBC Breakfast that I got an email from Dame Floella Benjamin in the House of Lords saying, I'd love for you to come in and meet with me. And she was amazing from the very first meeting, saying, I love your work. I love you as an organisation. I'd love to actually join with you, and I'd love to work with you on trying to campaign for this. And we were like, that would be incredible to have your voice. And she's a powerhouse. She is, if you want something done, she is your woman. And so we couldn't have asked for a better person to join with us. So we created a bill that went through the House of Lords, and it was going through each of the steps beautifully, passed every time. And without doubt, every time in the House of Lords, everyone would come up to us after and say, we're with you, we were willing to stand with you. And it just felt that really changed things for our campaign, thanks to her and the respect she has within the House. And it was not long after that, a year or two maybe, that the review was called for by the then Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt. And he apparently went to a few people and said who should be co-chairing and authoring this review. And my name was put forward as the person to do it. By that point, I'd already had a best-selling book on the subject. We were a global organisation leading the way in baby loss care. And I was also a trained professional in it. So I was asked whether I would take that on. And at the time they said, we're probably looking at a 1 day a week secondment. And hopefully it'll be all done in 6 months, which quickly became very apparent it wasn't the case, that the extent of the work was going to take years because nothing was not included within the review. If somebody would experience or encounter anybody in their care, we needed to look at that area right the way up to 24 weeks of pregnancy. So that's the whole NHS, that's every doctor's surgery, it's 999, 111. But then beyond all of the actual clinical care, it's looking at the emotional support and the emotional care. And also then looking at workplace, what do people encounter when they go through loss in the workplace? Do things need to change around that? Right the way through to how are people educated about this? Let's look at schools and colleges. How are they teaching young people about loss and fertility, etc.? So it resulted in a six and a half year review. He said that he loved about what we were doing with the certificates, and he'd be happy for us to include the certificates within the review if I could show how it could be administered. and rolled out from a government perspective. So myself and Sam Collins, the other co-chair and author, were really passionate about, we were going to make this happen. So as well as all of the other recommendations, that this certificate had to happen under our piece of work. I was appointed in March 2018. The review was laid in Parliament in July 2023. And that had 73 national recommendations to completely overhaul the care system that's in place. There was no area that we didn't cover, and that also included rolling out of the certificates. And the certificates were launched in February 2024, and in October 2024, they were rolled out to everybody. So initially only people who had had losses in a certain time period could apply, but as of October, everybody can apply, and they are fully backdatable. So anybody who's experienced a loss at whatever stage, whether that be after implantation, after going through clinics or IVF, or whether that be at any point in early pregnancy, right the way up to 24 weeks of pregnancy, you can apply for a certificate. You don't need medical proof, because for the majority of people, nearly 80% of people, loss happens in their home settings. So for many, nothing's even recorded on their GP notes or in the hospital notes. So it was important for us that people could self-declare to get hold of a certificate. And that also meant people who'd lost babies 70, 80 years ago would be able to go online, apply for a certificate, and get a certificate that they never thought ever would be available to them. And that was really important to me as the campaigner who had been pushing for these. The fact that no one would miss out, that I didn't want it just to be families from this point on going forwards. We wanted everybody to be able to have that piece of paper to show them that their little one existed and was formally being recognised by the government.
Well, I just want to say firstly, Zoe, a huge thank you to both you and Cherilyn. And I think it shows the power of campaigning, that you both did tirelessly make the case to government, and actually it has been brought in as a new policy. And we'll put the link in the show notes so that mums can get the link of where to apply to have on themselves. And so we've rushed through the episode, and I'm afraid we're getting towards the end. So the last question I always like to ask guests is just a really practical one. We know that most of the listeners to the show are affected families looking for help. So firstly, with your own charity, Mariposa, if they're looking for help and they want to reach out to you, what's the first step? And secondly, is there anything that you've personally found helpful as a resource that you'd also like to signpost families to who've also suffered from baby loss that might help them?
Yeah, so for anybody who needs support, we are there for you. And all you need to go to is sayinggoodbye.org, and you can access all the support and care you need. You can be given a befriender within usually 48 hours of contacting the organisation. You don't need to wait. And that support is available to you whether you've gone through a recent loss or a loss 50, 60 years ago. If you're grieving, if you feel like you need support to process that grief and that trauma, we are there for you as an organisation. In terms of what's helpful, I think reaching out to people is always helpful, that there's so much silence around this subject and people don't know what support is available. Also, don't be afraid to access support via social media. You know, you can find me, Zoe Adele, on Instagram, or the charity at sayinggoodbye_charity on Instagram. And that sort of support is actually really beneficial for baby loss, because often it can feel pretty overwhelming, and to actually even make a phone call to ask for help or send an email can sometimes feel a bit much. And so I always say, make that first step by accessing the support via social media. We post daily quotes, daily support alongside those quotes to help people not feel alone. And even the conversation within the chat sections of those areas can be so healing to people, to know the fact that they're not alone in what they're feeling. because the isolation can so magnify the feelings of grief and solitude, and actually just being able to connect with others or to see somebody sharing what they feel and going, okay, that's normal, me too, that can make so much difference. So whether you feel like you're in a place where you can just dive in and ask for help straight away, or just tiptoe into getting that support, that's okay. The important thing is not suffering in silence. And for those who are trying to support those who have gone through loss, I would say don't be scared about asking how they are. Often I'm asked, well, if I bring it up, is that going to be traumatizing for people? What if they'd prefer not to mention it? And in all of my years, in my 25 plus years of working in this field, I have never, ever spoken to a family who doesn't want their baby to be mentioned, ever. And it might not be always the best time. And they might say, I'd love to talk about this, but not right now, because I don't want to ruin my makeup, for instance, at an event. Can we touch base with this next week or something? But I've never heard of somebody being offended or upset or more traumatized because people mention it. They've not forgotten what they've gone through. They've not forgotten the pain and the suffering and the heartbreak. And actually what most of those families are terrified of is other people forgetting, that they've gone through something awful, and also forgetting that their baby existed. They might not be in their arms, but they've still had a child. And so don't be afraid to ask how people are. Put a note in your diary on key anniversaries, and on the lead up to those anniversaries, send a card, send a text, send a message just saying, I'm thinking of you. Please don't suffer in silence. No, I'm here. Those things seem really small, but actually they're huge to bereaved families.
Well, that's really helpful practical advice, Zoe. And can I thank you firstly for sharing your story, which I think was so powerful to hear, but also for that really practical advice for families who are out there. And I absolutely agree with everything you just said. And that's why this podcast is called Breaking the Taboo, because we want to speak about the difficult subjects so that families know that they're not alone, that it is okay to ask for help and to get resources. So can I thank both of my guests, Cherilyn and Zoe, for coming on today's episode of Breaking the Taboo. And I know this is a really difficult subject. So if you have friends or family who've also suffered from baby loss, then please do share this episode. We're here to help. That's why we have done today's show. There'll be lots of notes on my website, which you can find of links to the baby loss certificates and how to register for one. Also links to the charities such as SANS and Mariposa that we've mentioned on today's episode. And if you're enjoying our series of Breaking the Taboo, then please do rate us on iTunes and Spotify. And please send in also your suggestions for future topics on the show. We chose baby loss as a topic because it was the highest number of requests that we received on series 1 for us to talk about. So we do read your reviews and your feedback, and we'd love to hear from you as our listeners. So thank you both for coming on today's show, and tune in next week to the next episode of Breaking the Taboo. Bye-bye for now.